Drive, Daniela Valen said as she yanked open the sleek black car's passenger door and flung herself onto the leather seat, clutching her oversized tote and a half-crushed coffee cup. I'm already late, and if my boss breathes near me today, I might scream. Isaiah Grant blinked once, then looked down at the steering wheel of his own car. He hadn't even parked in a rideshare zone. He had just pulled up to check a message and grab his blazer from the back seat before heading into the building for an investor meeting. But now a woman with wild curls, flushed cheeks, and a voice full of fire had just commandeered his car like she owned it. "You're not my usual Uber," she muttered, buckling her seatbelt and tapping something on her phone. "But whatever, I don't have time to cancel and wait for another." Isaiah opened his mouth to correct her but then shut it just as fast. She was beautiful. Not polished or practiced like the women who usually circled him at charity galas and private auctions. No, she was real. Her lipstick was smudged, her blouse was half untucked, and her eyes were lit with a kind of frantic energy that didn't care who he was or how much money he had. And for once in his life, Isaiah didn't correct someone's assumption about him. He put the car in drive. "You sure you're headed to the Vance Publishing building?" he asked, pulling away from the sidewalk. "Yes." She sighed through her teeth. "You'd think after being there 2 years I'd be allowed to breathe without setting off alarms. But nope. One late arrival and I'm basically roadkill." He glanced at her. "Rough morning. Only if you count oversleeping, breaking a heel, spilling coffee on my blouse, and watching my last granola bar fall into a puddle." He chuckled and it startled her. She looked over, finally really seeing him. "You're very well-groomed for an Uber driver." He shrugged. "I like to keep things classy." She narrowed her eyes. "You're not one of those guys who tries to impress female passengers, are you?" "I might be," he said, mouth-twitching. Daniela rolled her eyes and looked out the window. "God. I'm too tired to deal with flirty drivers today." "I'm not flirting," he said. "Just being polite." He pulled up to the curb outside her office building. Before she could reach for the door handle, he turned slightly to face her. "What's your name?" he asked. She paused. "Daniela." "Isaiah," he said and extended his hand. She shook it, confused. "You don't usually get names from Uber drivers." "Maybe I'm not your usual Uber driver." She laughed. "No kidding." And then she was gone, hurrying into the glass building. Isaiah sat for a moment, watching her disappear into the sea of suits and briefcases. He was already late for his meeting, and he didn't care. 2 days later, Daniela nearly dropped her lunch tray when she saw the Uber driver striding through her office's executive floor like he owned the place. Because he did. He was in a tailored charcoal suit, his dark brown hair swept back, and that same calm confidence in his stride. People stepped out of his way. Executives nodded. A woman with a clipboard practically trembled as she showed him to the boardroom. "What the hell?" Daniela whispered, frozen mid-step. She pulled her coworker, Mia, aside. "Who's that guy?" Mia blinked. "Are you serious?" "That's Isaiah Grant." Daniela's stomach flipped. "He's the CEO of Grant Holdings." "What the hell is Grant Holdings?" she hissed. "Only the investment group that bought controlling interest in Vance Publishing last month. He's a billionaire, Danny." Daniela felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. "And he was driving an Uber 2 days ago?" Mia laughed. "Isaiah Grant doesn't need to drive anything. He has a driver and a private jet." Daniela's heart thudded. She remembered the car, the silence, his tailored coat slung in the back seat. The way he'd said, "Maybe I'm not your usual Uber driver." Oh my God. She bolted. She didn't expect him to find her again. But he did. 3 days later, she stepped out of her building after work, and there he was leaning against a matte black Aston Martin, arms crossed, in a navy jacket and jeans that looked effortless and expensive. He smiled when he saw her. "You're not running late today," he said. Daniela stared. Why, what are you doing here?" "Thought I'd give you a ride. Since I'm your favorite Uber driver." Her face burned. "You let me think you were." "I didn't say a word," he said. "You told me to drive. I drove." She folded her arms. "You're a billionaire. And you're still mad about the Uber thing." She opened her mouth, then closed it. I feel stupid." He stepped closer, voice softer. "Don't. I liked it. You talk to me like a human. Do you know how rare that is?" She didn't answer. "I'd like to take you to dinner," he said. Not as your driver. As me. She stared at him, stunned. Why? Because you made me laugh. Because you didn't care who I was. Because I can't stop thinking about you. Daniela blinked, thrown. He nodded to the car. Come with me. Her heart pounded. She got in. Dinner was at a rooftop restaurant with soft lights, sweeping views of the city, and a private table where waiters brought trays without anyone asking. Isaiah ordered for them both steak for him, sea bass for her, and didn't ask about her job or her resume. He asked about her favorite movies, what her dream vacation was, what her family was like. Daniela found herself laughing, more relaxed than she'd been in months. I still can't believe you let me think you were my Uber, she said over dessert. He leaned in. If I'd told you the truth, would you have talked to me? She hesitated. No, she admitted. Then I'm glad I didn't. The tension between them shifted, suddenly heavier, hotter. He brushed his fingers against hers on the table. She didn't pull away. By the time he dropped her off at her apartment, the city was quiet. Isaiah walked her to the door. She turned to him, heart hammering. Thank you, she whispered. For dinner. For not being who I expected. He smiled. And then he kissed her. It was slow, deep, and careful, like he'd been waiting for the right moment. When they pulled apart, her eyes were wide. He touched her cheek. I'll call you tomorrow. He didn't. He showed up the next morning with coffee and a bouquet of wildflowers. And from that day on, he didn't stop showing up. The first time Daniela stepped into the penthouse, she forgot how to breathe. She hadn't known where they were headed when Isaiah picked her up that night. He hadn't said a word, just held the door open to a different car this time. A sleek silver Maserati with buttery leather seats and an interior that smelled like cedar and something darker and richer she couldn't name. They'd driven in silence, music low, the city slipping past in a blur of lights and shadow. She thought they were headed to another restaurant. Then the elevator opened directly into a space that didn't look like it belonged on Earth. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across two walls, framing the skyline like it had been painted for him. The apartment was cavernous but not cold. Soft light spilled from sculptural fixtures, casting golden pools across polished wood floors. A fireplace burned low beneath a glass sculpture. Art hung in curated clusters, pieces she'd only ever seen in textbooks. Do you live in a museum? She asked, stepping out hesitantly. Isaiah tossed his keys on a marble console. I like beautiful things. She turned slowly, taking it in. You could fit my entire apartment in your foyer. You want to see the kitchen? I want to know why you brought me here. He glanced at her. Is that a request or a warning? Depends on your answer. He walked past her, poured 2 glasses of wine without asking, and handed her one. I figured you might want something quieter than another restaurant. She studied him. You don't strike me as someone who does quiet. He tipped his glass toward her. Then you don't know me yet. That night unraveled like silk. He cooked, didn't order in, didn't have someone waiting to serve. He rolled up his sleeves, pulled ingredients from a stainless steel fridge that looked like it belonged in a lab, and made pasta with roasted tomatoes and lemon zest while music played low in the background. She leaned against the island, chin propped on her hand. You cook. I do a lot of things people don't expect. Why pasta? It's the first thing I learned to make without burning the pan. She laughed. I'm sorry, but you don't look like you've ever burned a thing in your life. I've failed at plenty. He glanced at her. But I'm not afraid to try again. They ate on the balcony, city sprawled beneath them like a secret. She told him about the time she accidentally deleted an entire manuscript 2 hours before a deadline. He told her about the first company he invested in that tanked so hard the press camped outside his building for a week. You didn't hide? She asked, surprised. I faced it, he said simply. That's what you do when you care about something. You fight to fix it. She stared at him. I didn't expect you to be like this. Like what? Human. Isaiah leaned forward, the city lights catching in his eyes. Good, because I didn't bring you here to impress you. I brought you here because I wanted to stop pretending like I'm supposed to keep you at arm's length. Her breath caught. He didn't move closer. He didn't have to. The space between them pulsed with something electric. You barely know me, she whispered. Not true. I know you don't take yourself too seriously. I know you hate being underestimated. I know you're loyal to a fault and you work harder than anyone around you. I know something breaks in your voice when you talk about your father and you chew your lip when you're trying not to cry. She blinked rapidly. You've been watching me. I've been listening. She set her glass down before she dropped it. I don't do this, she said. Neither do I. Then what are we doing? He stood and walked to her side of the table. When he offered his hand, she hesitated only a second before placing hers in it. He led her inside. She didn't stay the night. He didn't ask her to. But the way he kissed her at the door, like he was memorizing the shape of her pulse, made her wonder if she'd ever sleep again without dreaming of him. The next week spun into a rhythm that felt like it belonged in someone else's life. He sent her a handwritten note on cream stationery folded into a square and slid into her office mailbox. Her name was written in bold, deliberate strokes. Inside, "I'm thinking of you. Meet me tonight." No signature, just a time and an address. She went. The gallery was closed to the public, lit only by spotlights. He was waiting for her in front of a massive canvas streaked with blue and gold. "You rented a gallery?" she asked, stunned. "I wanted to see your face when you saw this painting alone." "Why?" "Because it reminded me of your laugh." He didn't touch her until she touched him first. She kissed him in front of the painting. He kissed her like the whole world had narrowed to the space between their mouths. After that, it was impossible to pretend things were casual. He didn't call her his girlfriend. He didn't need to. He flew in her favorite author for a private meet and greet when he found out she'd been trying to get a book signed for her little sister. He stood silently in the corner while the author and her sister gabbed over tea in a private lounge at one of the city's most exclusive hotels. He never took credit. He just watched her smile. One night, she asked him why he kept doing things like that. "I like seeing what happiness looks like on your face." She swallowed hard. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why?" "Because it makes me want to believe this is real." He reached across the table and took her hand. "It is. But it wasn't always perfect. There were moments that cracked the surface. Like when she found herself seated next to Isaiah at a benefit dinner, and a woman in a diamond-drenched gown leaned over and whispered, "Darling, I didn't know Isaiah was bringing someone new." Daniela smiled tightly. "Neither did I." Isaiah's hand found hers under the table, but the moment lodged like glass beneath her ribs. Later, when they were alone, she sat on the edge of his bed, arms crossed. "Is that how they all talk to you?" she asked. "Who?" "Women who wear their net worth around their neck." He slid his watch off. "She's irrelevant. She knew you well enough to sound territorial. I've been to 1,000 of those events. Standing next to someone doesn't mean they matter." Daniela looked at him, vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen before. "I don't belong in your world. Then I'll build one that fits us both." She didn't answer, but she didn't leave either. They didn't always agree. They didn't always understand each other. But every time the uncertainty crept in, he found a way to cut through it with gestures that were too personal to be performative, too precise to be coincidence. He didn't try to convince her with money. He convinced her with attention. When she had a terrible day at work, he didn't offer solutions. He wrapped her in his arms and let her rant until her voice cracked. When her landlord raised her rent, he didn't offer to buy her a place. He helped her hunt through listings and sat on the floor with her late into the night, pizza box between them, comparing neighborhoods. "You know," she said, "most people in your position would have just handed me a key and called it a solution. I'm not most people." She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time she didn't feel small beside him. She felt seen. By the end of the month, they'd stopped pretending there was any distance between them at all. But just as quickly as it had begun, something changed. On a Friday afternoon, she walked into her office to find her supervisor standing over her desk with a thin envelope in hand. "You've been reassigned," he said. Daniela frowned. "To what?" "Direct liaison to Grant Holdings." She stared. "Why?" "Because the board thinks your relationship with Mr. Grant presents an opportunity for stronger coordination between our leadership teams." She felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. Her name was in that envelope. And so was the beginning of something that felt dangerously close to a test she wasn't ready for. "You didn't tell me?" Daniela said, standing just inside the foyer of Isaiah's lower Manhattan office suite, her voice low but thrumming with restrained fury. He closed the door behind her with a soft click, his face unreadable. "They reassigned you. I didn't order it. You didn't stop it either. I didn't know it would be a problem." She let out a sharp breath, walking past the velvet-backed chairs and minimalist console without looking at them. You honestly thought I'd be fine reporting to a board that only gave me a seat because of who I'm dating? Isaiah folded his arms but stayed silent. It makes me look like I earned it with your bed sheets, not my brain. That's not how I see you. That's not the point, she said, turning to face him. You don't have to see me that way. Everyone else already does. He studied her carefully. You think I don't understand what it's like to be underestimated? She gave a bitter laugh. You own half of Manhattan. When I started, I couldn't get a bank to return my calls. I had to pitch investors from a rented basement in Queens because I couldn't afford the security deposit on an uptown office. Daniela went still. I know what it feels like to work twice as hard for half the respect, he continued. But I also know when to stop fighting battles solo. She crossed her arms. What are you saying? That you don't have to prove anything to me. And you don't have to burn out trying to prove it to them either. The silence between them stretched wide. Finally, her voice softened. I don't want to be your charity. You're not, he said. You're the first person who ever looked through me instead of at me. That's not something I'd ever try to buy. She looked away, jaw tight. I'll decline the reassignment, she said. No, he said, stepping closer. Take it. She shook her head. Do it on your terms, he finished. Make it impossible for them to pretend you didn't earn it. Her eyes flicked to his, cautious. You really think I can? I know you can. Her breath caught. Then stay out of my way, she said. Isaiah's mouth curved just slightly. I wasn't planning on getting in it. She turned to leave, but paused at the door. Don't you dare pull strings behind my back. I won't, he said. But if you ever decide you want something, I'll move heaven to give it to you. She didn't respond. But she didn't slam the door behind her either. The weeks that followed reshaped everything. Daniela's new role came with its own glass-walled office, a team of 3, and a direct line to the Grant Holdings Advisory Board. She stepped into rooms where she'd once only taken notes and found herself sitting across from people who measured power in net worths and quarterly projections. She made herself impossible to ignore. Her voice cut through boardroom chatter with precision. She spotted gaps in proposal briefs others missed and refused to let her ideas be softened or polished for palatability. When executives tried to wave off her concerns, she met them with data, not deference. And when Isaiah joined meetings, he didn't look at her differently. He didn't speak for her and he didn't shield her. He listened. He waited. And when she spoke, he stayed silent until she was finished, even when others didn't. It didn't go unnoticed. One afternoon, after a particularly tense strategy session, a senior partner leaned in and said, I see why he's interested. Daniela met his gaze, cool and steady. You mean me or my mind? He smiled. Either way, you're a dangerous combination. She didn't smile back. Outside the boardroom, things between her and Isaiah simmered, shifting into something deeper. He never asked to define what they were. He didn't need to. He showed up when her sister needed help with college applications, sitting on her apartment floor with a laptop and a stack of brochures. When her mother visited unexpectedly from Queens, he reserved a table at a quiet bistro and asked about her childhood with genuine curiosity. He never flaunted his wealth in front of them. He never had to. One night, after a long day navigating a merger presentation, she came home to find a small, flat box on her kitchen counter. Inside was a single sheet of archival paper framed in glass. It was a rejection letter. Her first one from the publishing internship she'd applied to in college. She stared at it, confused. Then she saw the note beneath it, written in his sharp, slanted handwriting. Proof that even the smartest people get told no, and that it never means they're wrong. She stared at it for a long time. When she finally called him, her voice was quiet. You kept this. You mentioned it once. I tracked it down. You framed my failure? I framed your beginning. She swallowed hard. I'm not good at knowing what to do with people who do things like this. You don't have to do anything. Just don't run. That night she didn't. But not everything stayed smooth. The night of the Grant Holdings Gala arrived like a storm. Isaiah hadn't told her she'd be seated at the head table. He hadn't told her she'd be expected to speak. She found out when a woman in a glittering ivory gown took her arm as she stepped out of the car. Ms. Vallon, you'll be introduced after the toast. Daniela turned to Isaiah, who was already halfway up the marble steps. She caught up with him as cameras flashed along the red carpet. You didn't tell me I'd be speaking. I didn't know until this afternoon. You could have warned me. You would have skipped it. She glared at him. You don't get to make that choice for me. I didn't, he said. I just didn't give you a chance to make the wrong one. He watched her expression shift. You're going to be brilliant, he added. She didn't answer. Inside, the ballroom gleamed like a dream. Chandeliers dripped with light. Global CEOs and media elites moved through the space like gravity bent toward them. When Daniela took the stage, her heart thudded so hard it drowned out the applause. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked at Isaiah. And somehow that was enough. She spoke about innovation, about courage in the face of doubt, and about the power of unexpected voices. When she stepped down, the applause was louder than before. But it was Isaiah meeting her at the bottom of the steps that anchored her. You made it sound like it was all your idea, she whispered. He leaned in. It was all you. But just as her confidence solidified, the cracks in their foundation began to show. Late one night, she walked into his penthouse and found a woman in a black pantsuit standing near the window holding a folder. The woman turned, startled. Oh, I didn't realize you had company. Isaiah stood from the couch. We were just finishing. Daniela waited until the woman left before speaking. You've been signing off on the Vance expansion without telling me? Isaiah's jaw tightened. It wasn't finalized. You knew I was working on the cross-departmental proposal. You let me waste hours on something you'd already decided. I didn't think it would matter. It does, she said, voice rising. Because this isn't just about us anymore. It's about everyone watching to see if I'm just your pet project. Isaiah stepped closer. I didn't mean to undercut you. But you did. He was silent. I need to know something, she said, voice trembling. If I walked away from you right now, would you pull your support from Vance? His eyes darkened. No. Would you make it harder for me? Never. Would you stop showing up? He hesitated. She felt the breath leave her chest. I don't know how to love you halfway, he said. She swallowed hard. Then maybe we need to figure out if we're building the same future, she said. And for the first time since she got into that car, she turned and walked away from him. The morning after she left his penthouse, Daniela stepped out into the street with her hands trembling and her throat raw. The air had the first bite of winter in it, and she welcomed the sting against her cheeks. She walked past the bakery she used to stop at every Friday, past the silent newsstand with its early editions, past the doorman who nodded but didn't smile. Her apartment felt too small, her office too sharp. Everything around her moved like it had somewhere better to be. She didn't hear from Isaiah that day. Or the next. By the end of the week, she'd memorized the sound her phone didn't make. Still, she threw herself into work. She met with division heads, restructured the liaison team, and rewrote the upcoming proposal by hand twice. She said yes to every meeting. She said no to anything that felt like pity. She stayed late. She left earlier than she needed to. She answered questions with answers, not explanations. And every time someone mentioned his name, she nodded like it didn't make her heart twist. The boardroom was colder without him in it. She told herself it was the central air system. When the next gala invitation arrived, she almost didn't open it. But the envelope was thick, the lettering unmistakable. Inside, a single card waited. Her name was printed beside a seat number. She hesitated only a moment before slipping it into her desk drawer. The night of the gala, she stood in front of her mirror and forced herself to breathe. She wore a dress she'd saved for something else, something not tied to him. Her hair was swept into something deliberate, her jewelry minimal. She walked the carpet alone, ignoring the cameras, ignoring the questions. Inside, the ballroom glowed. Gold light danced on polished wood. The air was thick with perfume and ambition. Isaiah was already there. He stood at the far end of the room, speaking to a man in a navy tuxedo, his expression unreadable. His posture rigid, composed wasn't the one she remembered. He looked like someone who hadn't slept well in days but refused to admit it. He hadn't seen her yet. She turned before he could. She made it halfway through a glass of champagne before the lights dimmed. A spotlight flared on stage. A man with a microphone welcomed the room, thanked sponsors, rattled off names with practiced ease. Then he paused. This year's keynote speaker was a unanimous decision, he said. Someone who has redefined what it means to be a bridge between innovation and legacy. Please welcome Daniela Valen. She froze. Her name echoed through the ballroom. She turned slowly, heart hammering. Isaiah hadn't told her. Hadn't warned her. He was looking at her now, his expression unreadable. She walked to the stage on legs that felt like glass. The applause was thunderous. She stood behind the podium, hands gripping its edge. She didn't look at him. Sometimes, she began, voice steady, you find yourself in rooms you never planned to enter. The kind of rooms where people assume they already know your story. They see your dress, your title, your +1, and they decide what you're made of before you've said a word. She paused. I've stopped trying to rewrite those assumptions. Now, I let my work speak louder than my presence. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. I've been underestimated, overlooked, misjudged, but I've also been given chances. Not favors, not shortcuts, real chances. And I've taken every single one seriously. She looked out at the crowd. I won't apologize for earning a seat at this table. And I won't pretend I got here alone. But I will promise this, I'll keep showing up, even when it's easier to walk away. Applause broke like thunder. She stepped down. But instead of returning to her seat, she walked straight toward the exit. She didn't make it far. He caught up with her just outside the ballroom doors. You didn't tell me, she said without turning. I didn't think you'd come if I did. You were right. Isaiah stepped in front of her. There's something I need to say. I think I've heard it all. No, he said. You haven't. She stared at him. He looked tired. Not worn down, just stripped bare. I didn't fall in love with you because you were different from everyone else, he said. I fell in love with you because you made me different. Her breath caught. I've spent years being the person everyone expects. The strategist. The fixer. The one who never loses. But with you, I didn't have to win anything. I just had to be real. She opened her mouth, but he kept going. I didn't step in to protect you. I stepped back and I watched you become everything they said you couldn't. And I've never admired anyone more. Silence stretched between them. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. I bought the apartment across from yours, he said. Not because I needed more space, but because I didn't want to be far from you even when we weren't speaking. She stared at the key. I don't want to fix your problems. I just want to be beside you while you solve them. You think a key is going to fix this? No, he said, but I hoped it might open something. She blinked back, sudden heat in her eyes. He stepped closer. I love you, he said. She exhaled sharply. I love you when you're furious. When you're silent. When you're brilliant and bold and impossible to reach. She didn't answer. He reached out and gently took her hand. And I'll keep showing up, even when it's easier to walk away. Her fingers tightened around his. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I. She looked up at him. Then maybe we do it scared, she said. He nodded once. And then he kissed her. This time it wasn't careful. It was everything they hadn't said, everything they'd been afraid to risk. When they pulled apart, the world felt quieter. I don't want separate lives, she said. Then let's build one together. He didn't take her home that night. He took her to a rooftop he'd bought 3 weeks earlier. One she didn't know existed. There was no furniture yet. Just string lights overhead and the city stretched wide beneath them. I was going to turn it into a private lounge, he said. Daniela looked around. No, she said. Don't. He raised an eyebrow. Leave it like this, she said. Unfinished. Open. He looked at her like she'd given him something sacred. Okay. They stood there, hands joined, wind tugging at their clothes, the city humming below like a heartbeat. 3 months later, she moved in. Not into the penthouse. Into the apartment across the hall. They kept their own spaces. Their own keys. Their own calendars. But they had shared mornings, shared meals, shared silences that didn't need filling. He didn't change her life. He made space for it to grow. On their first anniversary, he gave her a letter. Not a card. A letter. It was handwritten. And on the last page, beneath his signature, was one more line. I still remember the day you got into my car and told me to drive. She folded the letter carefully, heart full. Then she walked into the kitchen, kissed him once, and whispered, I still would. And that was all either of them ever needed. The first time Daniela saw the townhouse, it was raining so hard the streetlights blurred into streaks. Isaiah stood on the curb, umbrella in one hand, the other stretched toward her as she climbed out of the car. Her heels clicked against the wet pavement, and the wind caught her coat, flaring it behind her like a cape. You brought me to Brooklyn in a thunderstorm? She asked, brushing water from her sleeve as he led her up the steps. You'll understand in a minute, he said, unlocking the double doors. The interior was dimly lit, the hallway echoing with empty space. She could smell sawdust and plaster, the air thick with the scent of freshly sanded wood and something faintly citrus. The walls were bare, the floors unfinished. A tarp covered what looked like a marble fireplace. The staircase curved upward in a spiral of raw elegance. She turned slowly. "What is this?" Isaiah watched her with a quiet intensity. "It's ours." She blinked. "What are you talking about?" "I bought this for us," he said. "Not to move into tomorrow. Not because I think you need anything, but because I want to build something permanent. Not just around you. With you." Her breath hitched. He walked ahead, motioning for her to follow. The rooms unfolded like a blueprint of possibility. High ceilings, arched windows, a walled garden in the back that looked like it had belonged to someone's storybook grandmother. In one room, sunlight filtered through a skylight despite the storm outside. "This would be the library," he said. "You mentioned once you wanted floor-to-ceiling shelves." She stared at the beams overhead. "I said that one time in passing." I listened. They moved through the house in silence until they reached the top floor. A single room, nearly empty, looked out over the skyline in the distance. "I had them knock out the back wall," he said. "I want this to be your space. Whatever you want it to be." She turned to him slowly. "You're serious?" "I've never been more." Her voice was almost a whisper. "You bought a house for us." He stepped closer. "I bought a future." She looked down at her soaked shoes, then back up at him. "I don't know how to match that," she said. "You're not supposed to. You already gave me the only thing I ever wanted." "What's that?" "Your trust." She exhaled, unsteady. "I want to say yes to everything," she said. "But I need to know you're not just giving me a fairy tale." He reached into his coat pocket. She stilled. Isaiah didn't drop to one knee. He didn't make a speech. He didn't pull out a velvet box. Instead, he held up a small, square envelope. "I wrote you something," he said. "Before I bought the house. Before I knew how this would go. I wrote it because I didn't want my love to depend on timing." She took the envelope with trembling fingers, opened it, and read. It wasn't a proposal. It was a promise. She looked up at him, eyes full. He stepped forward, brushing wet curls from her cheek. "When you're ready," he said, "ask me." She stared at him. Then, without warning, she laughed. "You're unbelievable." "I know. You want me to propose to you? I want you to choose me freely." She tucked the letter back into her pocket. "You're lucky I love you." He leaned in. "I know that too." They stayed in the house as the storm raged, walking barefoot across the dusty floor, planning rooms they hadn't named yet. 2 months later, she walked into the library he'd promised her, now filled with books and a leather armchair she hadn't told him she wanted, but somehow he knew. He was standing by the window, phone in hand, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, reading something. She didn't speak. She just held out a ring. Simple. Gold. No diamonds. Isaiah turned slowly, eyes catching hers. "Marry me," she said. He didn't respond. He crossed the room and took her face in his hands like he was afraid she'd disappear. Then he kissed her like the question had been burning in his chest since the moment she'd first sat in his car and told him to drive. He took the ring from her hand, slid it onto his own finger. "Now you're mine," she whispered. "I always was." They married in the garden behind the townhouse. No press. No fanfare. Just her sister, his best friend, a few close faces, and the city humming quietly around them. She wore a tea-length dress with sleeves that floated like ink in water. He wore a navy suit with no tie and the ring she'd given him. They didn't write vows. They didn't need to. Afterward, they danced under string lights, barefoot on the stone patio, while her niece tossed petals into the air like confetti. The townhouse became their ground zero. They hosted late dinners where no one checked their phones. They adopted a dog with crooked ears and named him Galileo. They argued over shelf space and made up in the middle of the night with kisses that tasted like apologies and rain. He never stopped listening. She never stopped surprising him. When she received her first executive offer from another publishing firm, she turned it down. Not because she was afraid of change, but because she wasn't finished building what she'd started. He supported her without hesitation. When his company acquired a tech startup in Paris, she flew with him to walk the streets where he'd first dreamed of expanding beyond finance. They didn't chase perfection. They chased each other. One morning, while painting the nursery a shade of green they couldn't agree on, she paused mid-stroke and said, "Do you think he'll have your eyes?" Isaiah looked up from the crib he was assembling. She shrugged. Just a feeling. He walked over, paintbrush still in hand, and pressed his forehead to hers. I hope he has your fire. And your stubbornness. He grinned. God help us. They laughed until their sides ached. When their son was born, Isaiah cried for the first time in front of her. Not out of fear or joy, but because holding something so small and so perfect made him realize he'd spent his whole life building empires when what he'd really wanted was a home. And now he had one. Not made of limestone or glass, but of her. And love. And the beautiful, impossible choice she made when she asked him to marry her. They never stopped choosing each other. And they never would.